And we're back with Bedtime Stories, Grownup Edition, Short Stories, Unhinged, Part 2. When we left off, Renni and her professor were getting a little too close after the unexpected and untimely death of her mother. Over the summer, her and Dr. Indugu were working in New York City on a chemistry research project. Meanwhile, True and Stephanie were back home in North Carolina, and it was business as usual, or so it seemed. True was working for the summer at her family's restaurant and hanging out with Stephanie in her free time. And Stephanie, who was a communications major, was working on a project for her investigative reporting class. In the fall, she'd be taking a class where she knew that the final project would include investigating an unsolved crime or mystery from the past. And she decided to investigate a crime that happened close to home. And she started her investigation with her mother, Miss Cheryl. Miss Cheryl said, "Girl, I am not about to sit here and tell you all of my business so you can put it in some research project for school." Stephanie said, "Mom, I'm not going to put all the family's business in the research project, but I got to collect as much information as necessary in order to follow the trail. I'm simply going to put the information about the car accident. Of course, I am going to include some background details, but not all your personal business, Mom. Come on. Then why you need to ask me all these questions? Why do you need to know everything from the first time I met your daddy?" Stephanie said, "Well, that I need to know for my own personal use. I have a right to know my family history. I need to know how I was created, what the circumstances were." Miss Cheryl said, "Well, you know all of that, honey. You've asked me all of that before, and I've told you everything you wanted to know. What more is there?" Stephanie said, "That's what I'm asking you." After weeks of trying and digging, Stephanie finally got her mom to tell her all about her history with her father and as much as she was willing to share about her grandparents. Using the information that her mother did provide, Stephanie went and did some digging of her own. Eventually, she enlisted the help of LJ, her sister Angela's best friend. LJ was a police officer at the local police department, and he happened to also be in investigations. He was able to connect her with one of his counterparts back in the city in Georgia, where her mother and father met, fell in love, and got married. The morning of her planned trip to Georgia to go and meet that officer in person, she got a phone call from CT, Corey Thompson. Corey was the son of a local pastor. He came from a long line of pastors. He was a few years older than Stephanie. He was a recent college graduate who was in the middle of training to join the FBI. Very, very few people had any idea that Corey had law enforcement aspirations. And Stephanie was one of those very few people. Corey said, "What's up, Steph? What you getting into?" Stephanie said, "Oh, I'm getting ready to go to Georgia." "What you doing?" Corey said, "I'm in town for the weekend. I was hoping we could get up, but..." Stephanie was like, "Yeah, nah, I'm getting ready to hit the road." Corey said, "You want company?" Stephanie said, "Only if I can enlist your help with something." As the pair took the few hours drive from North Carolina to Georgia, Stephanie filled CT in the questions that were remaining and the suspicions that she had. Stephanie said, "Something's not adding up. First of all, I don't know a lot of Puerto Ricans, but the ones I know, their last names are not Spencer. And I'm having a real hard time tracing the Spencer lineage." CT said, "So what you thinking?" Steph said, "I'm thinking they was criminals on the run and they changed their name." Corey said, "Whoa, whoa, young investigative reporter. How you jump to that conclusion?" Stephanie said, "My father took us on road trips all around the country. And every time we landed in a new city, we stayed at these huge estates. And one time, I think we were in Wyoming somewhere. My father said that all of those estates were ours. I only remember 2 or 3 of the cities that we went to. And when I searched the land use records for those cities, for my father's name and my grandparents' names, I found property sales. All of those properties were sold to the same holding companies. When I searched around the country for properties owned by that holding company, I found estates in almost every state owned by that holding company." I even found one in Puerto Rico. Corey looked at Stephanie and said, "Damn, you're good." Stephanie said, "I highly doubt that my mother doesn't know more than she's telling me. But I have a feeling that there's a reason why she's not telling me." When Stephanie and CT finally got to Georgia, the officer was there waiting for them, and he had a very clear message. "You need to contact this attorney that represents your family. His name is Jeffrey Weinstein." Stephanie said, "So I came all this way and you're not going to help me?" He said, "There's very little that I can do. My hands are tied. I don't know what's going on, but I was told to stop digging." Stephanie looked at CT, CT looked at Stephanie, and they took the card with Jeffrey Weinstein's number on it. CT looked at Stephanie and said, "How about we check into our hotel and I'll check into Jeffrey Weinstein." A few hours later, Stephanie and CT pulled into the parking lot of the import export business, still registered as owned by the Spencer family estate. At the helm was a manager about the same age that her father Angel would be if he was still alive. At the hotel, Stephanie had showered, changed, called her mother and her sister, and become even more determined to find out what the heck was really going on. Both her mother and her sister attempted to dissuade her from digging any further and impressed upon her that she should just let this all go and come back home. Her mother tried to convince her not to discuss any of this with her big sister Angela and tried to also encourage her to call Weinstein. Between and during these calls, Stephanie was still digging. She'd found the addresses where her parents, grandparents, and Maria Wynn, her father's mistress, used to live. She'd also found several businesses in the area that had been owned by the Spencer family. At the same time, Corey was doing some digging of his own. He'd researched the attorney, Jeffrey Weinstein, and found a variety of public records, some sealed and some not, that had been filed or submitted with his name on it, including land deeds, business transactions, wills, and trust funds. He'd offered to send what he'd found to some of his contacts at the FBI and have them take a look, but Stephanie declined. He encouraged Stephanie to contact Weinstein first, but she wanted to go to this property. So here they are, confronting the man responsible for keeping the import-export business going. Mr. Delaney said, "It is so wonderful to finally see one of Angel's daughters again. You were born after your mother moved from Georgia, so I never had the pleasure of meeting you. It's been my privilege to be able to continue your family's legacy and help ensure that your mother had the financial resources that she needed to provide for you girls." Stephanie said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Delaney, but I want to know, how well did you know my father and my grandparents?" Mr. Delaney said, "Well, your grandparents and my parents were really close friends. I was an employee here from my days in college all the way until now." Stephanie asked, "So you and my father were friends?" Mr. Delaney said, "No, we had an employer-employee relationship." Stephanie asked, "Well, who were his friends? He had to have friends." Mr. Delaney said, "Have you spoken with the family's attorney?" Stephanie said, "No, I haven't. Why does everybody keep referring me to a family attorney?" Mr. Delaney said, "Because he'd be the most appropriate person for you to ask the interpersonal questions that you have." "No, he'd be the appropriate person for me to ask business questions. My interests are personal. So let's cut to the chase. What are you not telling me?" Eventually, Mr. Delaney confessed that he knew of one of Angel's friends who was alive and well. When Stephanie pulled up at the junkyard, they were met by two fierce pit bulls and an elderly man who said, "I'd know a daughter of Angel Spencer's anywhere. Which one are you?" Stephanie said, "I'm Stephanie Spencer, Angel and Cheryl's youngest daughter." Bobby, the man who owned the junkyard, said, "Your father figured you'd be the one." Meanwhile, in New York City, Renni was preparing for the final gala. NYU was hosting a gala for all of the professors and TAs who were participating in research there for the summer. It was formal and upscale, and Renni was ready to appear on the arm of Dr. Ndugu. Her plan was to ensure that he had plenty to drink, enough so that he'd need some help getting back to his room. And once there, he wouldn't be sleeping alone. All dressed in a curve-hugging gown, with her hair slayed to perfection, and very light, appropriate makeup, Rennie grabbed her clutch when she heard a knock at her door. Imagine her surprise when she opened the door, and on the other side was Dr. Ndugu and his wife. Dr. Ndugu said, "Rennie, are you ready to go? I'd like you to meet my wife, Isabel." "Isabel? This is one of my prize students, Rennie." Rennie just stared when Isabel said, "Oh, Rennie, it's nice to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you." Rennie said, "I wish I could say the same." Confused, Mrs. Ndugu looked over her husband and he said, "Did I neglect to mention that my wife would be here? I may have forgotten. She's been in Italy and she just got back today." Isabella said, "Just in time to accompany my husband to the gala." Rennie said, "Isn't that just peachy?" At the gala, Dr. Ndugu and his team, which included Rennie, received an award for the research that they'd done over the past 2 semesters, and his wife had been notified by the committee, and that's why she'd flown in for the special occasion. So Dr. Ndugu absolutely had plenty to drink that night, and he did need help returning to his room, just not Rennie's help. Rennie returned to her room furious. Not only was she pissed, but she was embarrassed as hell. The entire night, she was relegated to the table with the other TAs, staring and watching Dr. Ndugu and his wife, smiling and laughing, dancing the night away, sharing kisses and intimate touches, making introductions, and doing all of the things that she thought that she and Dr. Ndugu would be doing instead. The next morning, Rennie was still pissed. She skipped the farewell breakfast, packed up, and arranged for a cab to take her to the airport. When she got downstairs, who did she see other than Dr. Ndugu and his wife Isabella? She watched as Dr. Ndugu helped his wife into a cab, kissed her goodbye, and as he turned around to head back into the hotel, he and Rennie locked eyes. Dr. Ndugu said, "Rennie, where you going? The charter bus isn't taking us to the airport for another hour." Rennie said, "Where's your wife going? I figured y'all would be heading home together." Dr. Ndugu said, "No, she's heading back to Italy." Rennie said, "So she's not going back to North Carolina with you?" Dr. Ndugu said, "I didn't think you were listening to me at all last night. I guess you weren't. I told you, she's on a 9-month assignment in Italy, and she only flew in for the gala. She has a few weeks left, and it may just be extended, so we'll still be separated for." Before Dr. Ndugu could finish his sentence, he was interrupted by one of his peers. All Rennie heard was they were separated, and that was all she needed to hear. At that moment, the cab pulled up that Rennie had arranged to take her to the airport. Rennie waved the cabbie off and headed back inside. Dr. Ndugu was trying to say that they would be separated for a few more weeks by several continents. But Rennie had made up in her delusional mind that he was communicating his relationship status, and his estranged wife had flown in to keep up appearances in honor of his big day. So now, she needed a new plan.